Welcome to Talk Gnosis. This is an episode in our Mapping Gnosticism series. If you've been listening to the other ones, then you're going to get a sense of what this one is as well. We're not just talking about a particular subject of Gnosticism, we're actually also charting the territory. We're exploring the landscape of Gnosticism here where we are now in the summer of 2025. In one of our previous episodes, we talked about the need to map Gnosticism, the need to start to explore this territory. In this case, we're going to dive right into the core question at hand, Gnosis. We often talk about Gnosticism, but we don't often talk about Gnosis. We talk about the history of Gnosticism, where the texts come from, the theology or the cosmology, demiurges, archons, aeons, other dimensions, how some of these things reformat a Christian approach. We get really deep into the details, but it's all still after or beyond the point of the heart of it all, the Gnosis itself, this idea of saving knowledge. And so I think we're going to try to talk about what Gnosis might be, but I think we're also going to kind of talk about why we can't talk about it, why we jump over it to everything else. I'm Jason Memel. I'm one of the hosts here, and I'm joined by my co-host, Deacon Jon. Jon, do you want to say hi?
Hi, everybody.
Hey there. If this is maybe your first episode in a while, you're going to hear us have a conversation. This won't be as much of a presentation of facts or like interviewing somebody about something that they've got. This is more about what do we think we currently know? What do we think is interesting about this question? That kind of thing. And so in that respect, like Gnosis, what the heck is it?
Yeah, I just want to
answer
say
that.
to you, Jason, to reiterate exactly what you're saying, which is we were talking on off air, and this is what I say for my conclave lectures so that I don't have to plan for them as much, which is it's an exploration. Right. Jason and I don't actually have the answers per se. We have hopefully some very informed opinions. Right. Exactly. And we wanted to do the show and have this talk because there's going to be things that we're going to figure out from this talk live. So very exciting. And I suspect that there will be sequels to this show that we're going to change our mind about some of the things that we say. And it's also, as part of being an exploration, it's a dialogue. We do really want to hear from you. Please comment below. Please send us emails. Please comment on social media. Your definitions of Gnosis, your ideas about it, what you think we got right and what you got wrong. Really, let's get this exploration going as a group, as a community, because Jason and I need it. Not for involvement with the show so that the algorithm will like us better and push it into more people's feeds, but because Jason and I are spiritual explorers. We're not people who have all the answers or pretend to have all the answers. So if you join into this conversation with us, we will actually have more Gnosis, whatever that is.
Well, exactly. One of the things like we've joked before, the phrase, ask 3 Gnostics, get 5 answers. I think that's a good thing. I think the fact that there's not a single answer to any of this stuff is useful in terms of what we're trying to explore. I think that the idea of a mystery or an unsolvedness to this is actually kind of useful. And I would also say, and I've said this before too, if anyone is telling you they've got the one single secret of Gnosis or Gnosticism, turn around. Especially if it's coming from a particular like book or course or premium member feed or anything like that. If there's not multiplicity baked into what they're talking about, it's probably incomplete. It's interesting that we're in a way already slightly avoiding the subject of Gnosis, is that the general brush of the subject that most people might already know, or is just as a preface, is that Gnosis is often defined as experiential knowledge you gain by contact or by an experience, not by like a logical process of like reading a thing, understanding the text, and then now being able to repeat the text in a recitation kind of way. Often this is salvific, or it is described as salvific knowledge. This experience isn't just an experience, but it's an experience that changes you in some way that might be argued for the better in some particular way. And it is also, because it is experiential and not logical, it itself arguably can't be given in the sense of, I'm going to say this particular thing this particular way, and then bam, you get Gnosis, instant Gnosis. Is that a fair like overview of the understandings we currently have for the term?
Absolutely. And just for further clarification, and I'm sure there's lots of people who know this or have heard us talk about it before, but it's a Greek term. And in Greek, there's a number of different terms for different kinds of knowing, for different kinds of knowledge, right? So this is the Greek term for, as Jason said, experiential knowledge. If I was going to give a quick definition, I would say that it's experiential knowledge that leads to change, right? Even in some ways, structural change within the psyche. If you have an experience of the sacred flame, the element of the divine that is contained both within yourself, but also other people, that is going to change your day to day life, right? Because once you see that divine spark in others and you see that they are divine, you see that they are actually the Christ, uh, your relation to them and how you treat them changes. So, there is a lot of things to talk about, Jason, and I think one place I'd like to start is sometimes when we talk about Gnosticism, Gnosis, or the Gnosis, there's an idea that there's just the Gnosis, that there is this one experience that you have that kind of is the same for everybody, can't be put into words, but they are experiencing the same aspect of the universe of the divine, right? And this is the Gnostic experience that leads to the Gnosis continuing on. But I would argue that what Gnosticism wants us to do, what is there sort of structurally, is of course there's a variety of experiential knowings, right? That Gnosis is a journey. It's not just one and done, and that there is a variety of things that we discover about ourselves, about the divine, about other people that sort of add up over time. All within this experiential knowledge that you're talking about. Now, of course, this kind of knowledge has a deep relationship with other ways of knowing, right? So, you do want to read books and contemplate and listen to people and what have you. I think, too, sometimes with Gnosticism, there's a danger where people think they have a very specific idea about what Gnosis is, and that's the only kind of knowledge we should be trying to get, if that makes sense, right? So we're kind of pushing aside some of this other stuff, these other ways of knowing, but they have a deep relationship because I think when we're talking about some of the Gnostic experiences, particularly mystical experience, right? They're apophatic. They can't be put into words. Something happens to you which is completely outside of your day-to-day experience, peak experience that is completely different and can't be put into language, right? But see, the thing with this experience is afterwards you have to put it into language, both to explain it to other people or just to explain it to yourself, right? There's a retroactive to this experience that has to be kind of digested using our logical faculties. I guess I can say digest it logically, but I don't want to throw people off because when we say logic and logically, we don't mean sort of a formal way of thinking that comes from Greek philosophy, A, that B, what have you, right? A lot of the time, it's obviously we can, even with stuff that is mystical, not logical by our day-to-day standards or by the standards of the secular world, the human being, especially if you're trained in it, but even if you're not, it starts to go through a logical breakdown, right? It's how the brain works of what happened. So logic and these other ways of knowing, these other ways of thinking still play a very important role, even in this very grand mystical experience that cannot be logically understood, that cannot be put into words, right? Because retroactively, we have to try to understand what it means. And when we talk about Gnostic theology, Gnostic mythology, Gnostic community, these are the things that help us to situate these experiences when we're chewing on them later, right? So that's one of the reasons that they're highly important. And I want to say as well, this episode is sort of part of a unofficial trilogy, right? So this is the last one. So I guess this is the Return of the Jedi, right? And we had a talk with Ike Barker on his podcast, Arcanum. But it's not out yet at the time of this recording. And we also did a conclave exploration, right? There's some overlap between these three shows. So when they're all out, I'll put them into a playlist and put them on the YouTube for y'all. But of course, it's going to be 3 different episodes on 3 different topics spread over 3 different podcasts. But I think they do make a little trilogy. So,
well, if Gnostics are used to anything, it's going to a lot of different texts.
yes. Yes, exactly.
I do want to jump in for a second here, just because the way you were sort of framing the singularity of the unity idea of a Gnosis experience versus maybe the multiplicity of other ways of knowing, other ways of exploring. One of the things that it does also make me kind of think a bit about is something I've discussed. I can't remember if I've discussed it here, but I've said in general, is thinking about a lot of spiritual approaches, aesthetic approaches, etc., in this general overview, as thinking about them as scaffolding that you can put up around a thing that you can't actually hold, as a way to be able to appreciate the outline of it, even if you can't always directly see it. And I think the trick sometimes is not confusing the frame for the painting, or confusing the linguistic frame or the theological frame for the experience. And I think maybe that's just kind of something I wanted to put in there, is that the like Gnosis is this apophatic describable experience, and yet here we are describing it, here we are compelled to describe it or discuss it. So like to me, that is the assembling of scaffolds, the assembling of tools to try to get closer to it, but it's always in that service of getting closer to a thing that cannot be held by the thing you're approaching it with.
Yes.
There's always this paradox.
Yeah, and it is in some ways highly subjective, right? Because part of it is having insights that you didn't have before. People are, of course, are going to have different knowledge bases, different insights into reality already, right? Also, for it being subjective, particularly for these highly mystical experiences, they need to be put into words, understood, and of course, the way that we do that is unique to our own subjectivity, unique to our particular brain. So I think that's important to remember, that this element of subjectivity, because particularly when you're talking about encountering the one reality, divine reality, the true reality, perhaps everybody is doing this when they have a mystical experience. But there's always an element that changes, right? Because of the observer effect. So I think that's very important as well, because people often think that there's one experience to have that's experienced in the same way and gives you that same gnosis afterwards, if that makes sense. So there is this element of subjectivity. And I think this is maybe a whole show, but there obviously is a subjective aspect to encountering the divine, right? Maybe these encounters are, they are encounters with not something that we would understand as a supernatural exterior, but an encounter with archetypes that are deeply wired into the human being, right? So therefore your interaction with the archetypes is going to be different. Or something else, which is, if there is a more supernatural reality, we know that people experience this reality in all sorts of different ways, right? So the Christians who don't know anything about Hinduism do not have a lot of visions of Krishna, right?
Yeah, not just emergent visions of Krishna without any prompting.
Yes, exactly. It does seem that the imaginative faculty within the human being seems to, even though we're talking about having an experience that is outside of the five senses, the sixth sense, imagination, seems to be the instrument, the faculty, the sense that human beings interact with this reality, this mystery, whatever it is. And it seems that the imagination filters and shapes. And if you are having something that's a little less apophatic, right, which is a literal manifestation, statue of Mary starts talking to you, Jesus appears to you on the cross. And these are not that uncommon when you look at religious history. They're not that uncommon, period. Even now in the modern world, they're definitely less common. This seems to still be filtered because people know this mythology, they know these divine figures. So it seems that the mystery of the divine, this is how it connects to us, right? Though there does seem to be some element where the imagination is used. And that seems to be what Alan Moore would say is happening, right? But
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth.
and I was going to say, it sounds very modern, even postmodern, and I think people are getting the idea this is a good thing. I'm being complimentary to this process because imagination has a negative connotation in modern English. But this does seem to be what the ancient Neoplatonic mystics, who were quite close to the Gnostics, their beliefs and their mythology physically close to the Gnostics, because the Gnostics came and studied at Neoplatonic academies. We know that Plotinus did not like having them around. So they thought that the imagination was this incredibly actually heightened the faculty of the human being, right? And that it was different from what they called fantasia, which is something closer to daydream, hallucination, imaginative spectacle within the mind that doesn't actually reflect anything deeper. So they did see that there's a difference between the two. But I've heard it argued as well. I believe Elaine Pagels says that in The Secret Gospel of John, there's this. We always focus on Sophia as the divine feminine figure, but the texts actually have a variety of the divine feminine figures. Now, some of them are sort of on a scale, a gradient. You know, the reflections of Barbelo, and then below Barbelo, you have forethought, and then below forethought, you have Sophia, and maybe below Sophia, you have Eve, and these are actually reflections of the same higher entity. That also seems to be happening in some cases. Forethought is very interesting because the technical Greek term that's used for that word, Elaine Pagels argues actually forethought's not the best translation. They're using the term in a very technical way, and it's perhaps not the usual term that would be used in Greek, but what they mean there is imagination. So, or forethought in Secret Book of John really is much more salvific than Sophia is, very active, right? So, tying this back in, even the Gnostic texts perhaps are indicating that imagination is an important aspect of Gnosis and the Gnostic
Yeah.
experience. Yeah.
Well, and it's like, it's this thing too, like you kind of mentioned earlier, imagination might have a derogatory term. It might be used derogatorily when discussing religion. There's something there too about, so like one of the things that I think a lot about is that on this subject is that when we think about comparing, bringing in psychological terms, Jungian psychology, talking about imagination, the assumption is usually that we're saying this to reduce the experience. We're saying it's just imagination, or it's just psychology. And I think that that isn't necessary. And I mean, I am not deeply versed in Jungian studies or Jung himself, but I don't even think that Jung was trying to reduce the mystical landscapes that he was exploring to psychology at a core level. Like he may have been in terms of practice, he may not have been jumping right to magic or religion, but I don't think he was ever trying to solve religion. And part of the reason I'm going down this road is to say that rather than thinking about having a Jungian experience as a Gnostic experience as a way to reduce it, it might be more a matter of saying, this is a modern handle to hold an ancient thing. You know what I mean? Like a way of holding onto that thing. And even just when we talk about imagination in a very broad sense, like maybe if one way, just what you mentioned there about Sophia being compared to not just forethought, but imagination, is that maybe we could even think about imagination as being the membrane or the transmission medium by which Gnosis could happen. Like that's, I mean, maybe that's a bold statement, but it's not that all imagination leads to Gnosis, but that maybe no imagination definitely doesn't lead to Gnosis.
Yes, yeah, that's a great way to think about it. It connects very well with our repeated emphasis on art, right? The creation of art, the enjoyment of art, the transcendent experience that you can have both creating art and experiencing art, right? You can have an apophatic experience gazing at a painting or during a piece of live music or at the theater. We say a lot in a secular society, if people aren't religious or spiritual, this is where they often do have transcendence, right? Reading or consuming art. And sometimes that leads people to spirituality, right? So, they gazed at that Rothko painting and they were transported to an altered state of being.
There are, like, I think everyone has maybe experienced, arguably, the moment of reading a particular like book or poem, and not until you read that line did you realize that someone had put into words a feeling you'd already had.
Yes.
And that is like, again, that's not Gnosis, but that is a little brushing of it, like a little sensation of like, there is a universal, or at least a communal experience that we can only continue to find handles for, continue to find methods for through art, through the experience of putting our mind closer to someone else's mind through this, like, as we're saying there, this transmission medium of imagination. So as much as I could just turn this into a pro art diatribe, there is something you kind of said earlier too, that there's something that's fundamentally changing about a Gnostic experience. So like the difference of Gnosis, of like, I make theater, I feel like if I'm really doing my job and the audience is really connected to the work that I'm making, even and especially if that work doesn't have a religious core to it, that moment for them might be a little brushing of Gnosis. But we're kind of not just talking about that. We're talking also about the kind of Gnosis that leaves you completely transformed, that leaves you trying to process that into language and ideas that then change other people. Like I'm thinking about Philip K. Dick as an example of somebody who maybe had a not super pleasant experience of Gnosis and then spent the rest of his life trying to figure it out. Yeah, I guess maybe to just kind of draw on that transformative element, that notion of it being transformative is better because salvific implies like a moral trajectory, whereas Gnosis doesn't necessarily just give people good things. you know?
Yes. Yes, exactly. I think that's really important, Jason. And it also kind of moves us past, okay, if I have X amount of Gnostic experiences, then I become some sort of enlightened super being. Morality plays into that, right? Okay, I've become enlightened. That means I can't do anything wrong. You know, I think as well, going back to what you're saying about Philip K. Dick, and it's something else that we say a lot on the show, right? Is that maybe one of the first Gnostic experiences that people have, or a common one, is actually very negative, right? It's an existential torment almost. It's a waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat because you realize that there's something wrong, not just with you or with the world or with other people or with materiality, but that there's a crack in the universe itself, right? And then this is a terrifying thing, but you can see how it leads to a change in one's life, a gnosis, and sort of a drive, right? So it's like, okay, everything's broken. Why is that true? Why is everything broken? Can I help fix it? Where is God? What is God? We can see how having these experiences trickle down into this rational, kind of logical processing afterwards. So I think that is very important because we live in this society that is very pleasure seeking, that is very consumerist, where people only want positive things and they're only going to put time, money, and effort into getting positive things. At the end of the day, we do this show as a public service, right? But we're not trying to sell Gnosticism to anybody. We're not trying to convert anybody. And if we were, it's a bad marketplace, right? Hey, spend all your time and money and effort so that you can have these negative experiences and find out why the universe is broken, right? It's not a great sales pitch. But at the end of the day, that's not what we're for. It's not what Gnosticism is for. Staying with the negative, Jason, I think as well, I decided to raise my blood pressure up a couple points today. Visit Reddit, right? And check out our Gnostic, the community that has wonderful mods and some wonderful contributors. And somebody there was just saying, oh, is this the Gnosis? Is this Gnosticism? Somebody maybe perhaps doesn't like Gnosticism. And then they were just going through the mythology of the demiurge and the archons and the fall and the materiality and all that stuff, right? Is this the Gnosis? And you know what? I actually would say partially yes to that. I believe, and this isn't my theory, lots of scholars have said this, that an aspect to whatever the understanding what the Gnosis was for the ancient Gnostics was the revealing of the secret of that the universe is broken. Right. Now, of course, that is not Gnosis per se, because as we were talking about, it's experiential. It can't just be told to you, but perhaps you were then expected to have a Gnostic experience once you have this knowledge, or perhaps it would lead to Gnostic experiences once you have this mythology in this text. So many of these early Gnostic groups, probably what would happen, a book like the Secret Book of John, is, you would be part of this community, part of this religious community, philosophical community, Christian community. You would study with them for a while, and there'd be an inner circle, and they would reveal these secret truths to you, right? So you would be taken into a room, and the teacher would give you the Secret Book of John and, explain the archons, explain the demiurge, what have you. So I think this is part of the Gnosis, right? Is having this mythology, using this mythology, but of course now it's much more public, right? It's not a secret. And sometimes this worked it seems like the Valentinians, they started off as a church within a church. So you would basically have an after church study group, right? Where you would look at Valentinian ideas and look at the deeper meaning of what you just heard in church that day. And this is how that process would work out, right? As you sort of met more of this group, got to know them, got more gnosis, kind of showed you what was going on, then they would kind of let you in on the secret. In the Valentinian mythology, the demiurge isn't negative or evil, but it's still ignorant, right? There's still an issue with the world where it comes from a mistake, where there's an aspect of reality which is unknowing and confused. So I think that is still an important part of the Gnosis.
I want to push back maybe even a bit on this. This is what I want people to hear, is I want to hear us kind of like, even in some senses, even disagreeing or at the very least engaging on these subjects. So there's a couple of things. I think like the idea, like when we start talking about either current or historical church groups, there's sort of this thing of like, well, it seems to me that there's a fair question of like, if there's a Gnostic group or church, does that mean that everyone in that church achieves Gnosis, like receives
Mhm.
Gnosis? Like that's, as I think one of the other things, if it isn't already clear, is that Gnosis doesn't come easily. It doesn't just show up automatically. So here's what we're saying about religion. Here's what we're saying about theology. And it's coming through this Gnostic lens, is that if people are getting on board with this as quote unquote Gnosticism, but are not in pursuit of Gnosis itself, I mean, honestly, this has always been kind of a thing for me. Like, how far can you take? And this is going to the question of that person on Reddit that you noted. And I think I even wrote a response to them on the subject, is that like how far is somebody who is interested in Gnosticism willing to take either the classic Gnostic texts or whatever content they find online today that is inspired by those texts, and just run with it and say this must be true, because I think I would question, or like I would question the ability to use any of those as a baseline assumption for how to live your life, because you're not dealing with a text, and you're not dealing with a text or a tradition that is ever meant to operate exactly at that level, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
It does.
Um,
I don't think we were in any disagreement.
yeah.
For me, it's just more of I think it's still an aspect of Gnosis, should be an aspect of Gnosis within the religion of Gnosticism, right?
Mhm.
But I completely agree with you. More of a historical note that the ancient Gnostics probably understood this as part of the Gnosis. I think it
Mhm.
still plays a role now, but with all the caveats and asterisks that you just laid out, right? I mean, I just talked about why would anybody want to join this religion or know more about it, but obviously there's lots of people like you and I, right?
Yeah.
And I think something else that sometimes gets in our craw, Jason, is the mythology is very exciting. It's very weird. It's very sci-fi. It's very fun. That's what draws people in, right? So, and I understand why people just want to stay there, right? Okay, this is why I'm here. So this is what it's all about, right? Where really it's the icing on the cake. I think too
Well,
that this. Oh, go ahead.
sorry, and I keep interrupting you on this, but it's the icing on the cake. I think there's also a piece here too where, like, and I think I don't want to dive too deeply into debating the literalness of the demiurge and the archons and things like that. I think that will be another show, which we will definitely get to. But as relates to Gnosis, one thing I've often talked about, I've said this multiple times on the show, is that I see a lot of that cosmology as an emergent attempt to try to understand and explain, using often the mythologies of the times in which they were written, to explain why we don't get to live in Gnosis all the time. Like, that was a transcendent experience. Why am I not there all the time? I'm amending this a little right now on the spot, but it is also, I think, connected to the conversation we had at Conclave and just some more recent thinking on this, on the point of it. But I think if Gnosis itself can have a negative experience, then you might start to imagine, and I'm using imagination not in the derogatory sense, in a reductionist sense, but as a transmission medium to connect and build a scaffold around these experiences. You might imagine a scaffolding that has negative things in it, because those are helping connect to and explain the weirdness and the otherness, alongside perhaps the sense of unity and charity and love that you might have felt. Like, all of those things might be happening. One of the things you mentioned in our conclave chat is this notion of, or maybe I extrapolated this, but it's this sense of, if you're connecting with the divine, you might also be connecting with not just like another consciousness that's just bigger than you, but something that's actually so vast that consciousness isn't an appropriate way to try to talk about it.
Yeah.
And that, so like, it's almost a sense of loss. Like, you're like, oh, I am, like, there's no sky daddy, you know what I mean? There's no Zeus in the clouds that I'm connecting with, and my divine spark is connecting me to something that is so much other, that maybe whatever my divine spark is, I don't get to keep. I, like, Jason doesn't get to keep his Jasonness, in the astral hug of the monad. It just wipes out Jason, and it's just my spark gets to keep burning. That could be terrifying.
People who have experiences like that talk about how it's terrifying and painful. There's a lot of literature on that. And we talked about this in the conclave talk as well, even to the point of psychological depersonalization. I don't want to say that these are the same thing, right? That
Mhm.
the negative psychological symptoms of depersonalization is the same thing as a mystical experience or a view into how the self is unstable or made up of skandhas, if we're going to talk about Buddhism.
Mhm.
But, that said, here we have a similar experience, something that is, at least on paper, constructed in the same way, but one is in the five, right? Where it is overwhelmingly understood to be a negative psychological thing to encounter, right? So,
Mhm.
yes, no, 100%. And again, I think we're completely in agreement. To go back to what I was saying, which is about the relationship between then and now, right? So, when we're talking about our definitions of gnosis, what gnosis is or what it might be, this is very tricky. And again, another show, another mini series, this is something that every religious person and every theologian has to chew on, right? Which is, we live in a different world. We have a different subjectivity than ancient peoples. We think about the world differently. We interact with the world differently. At what point does reinterpreting them be authentic and helpful, useful is what we're always talking about. This idea actually useful. And at what point am I just making shit up that has nothing to do with ancient Gnosticism? And that's tougher than you would think.
Mhm.
It is, but it does also have to be done. And we do it unconsciously, right? You do it all the time. Anybody who thinks that, oh, I'm doing Gnosticism exactly like someone in the second century did is lying to themselves, right? There's
Yeah.
always a layer of interpretation. There is always a layer of adjusting these teachings practices to the modern day. And this is, of course, not just a split between modernity and pre-modernity. This is what every religious person has had to do since the beginning of humanity.
Mhm.
So obviously, this is an important aspect of religion. This reinterpretation, this reapplying. The ancient Gnostics didn't have some of the same ideas around gnosis that Jason and I have, or talking about, or that you have. Right? We are talking about people who would shit themselves to death if they saw a car, or television, or a smartphone. Right. So we do have to keep that in mind. We have a lot more scientific knowledge. We have a lot more knowledge about other religions. We have thousands of years of philosophy, right? The
Mhm.
original Gnostics were magpies. We should be able to put these bodies and ways of knowing together in a Gnostic framework, right? Because that's
Yeah.
what they did, and it's what we
Yeah.
should do. So yeah, just getting that all out there, because
No,
I think
no.
there is sort of an authentic way where we are using their teachings and their worldview and getting new interpretations, working within it in a way that makes sense for modern people. But that line is tricky, right? So, like,
Yeah.
there are some things, like an example of the line would be is the ancient Gnostics, were they actually talking about space aliens, right?
Right.
So that's a modern interpretation, and people do build entire spiritualities and cults. So what I say is that a valid, good, and helpful interpretation of Gnosticism? I would say no. I talk a lot. I don't know. I actually do think this is what the ancient Gnostics were saying, but if anybody ever challenged me on it, I would fold right away. Uh, but again, we're looking at John's interpretation of the Gnostics through John's interpretation of Hegel, and Hegel was interpreted by the Gnostic teachings, right? So
Mhm.
here we
Mhm.
have this big human centipede. And I thought it's very
God.
important to put out John's interpretation, because I've been talking about Hegel a lot on the show the last couple of years. So I've been reading a lot of him and a lot about him, but I don't really understand him. But yeah, this understanding that reality is dialectic and this whole and everything, right? Now, this would be a very common older interpretation of Gnosticism, where
Mhm.
newer interpretations are much more positive. Now, of course, the way I say it or explain it, it sounds negative, but actually, this contradiction, this contingency that lies in anything and everything is actually well, I don't want to say it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a description of reality, but it opens
Mhm.
up so much, right? Because we have contingency, because we have contradiction, we have an ultimate freedom, right? That both we have and that the universe has and that God itself has, right? And I think valid interpretations of Gnosticism, I think it's something that you see in the Secret Book of John, but again, sort of filter through what's called process theology and filter
Mhm.
through a bit of Hegel, because process theology comes from Hegel, right? Is this understanding that Gnosticism is the story of God trying to understand himself? This is in some ways a more modern interpretation, but it's pretty in the text, and you hear a fair amount of scholars and theologians get behind that, right? But that said, it's not there explicitly, and it is perhaps a little bit more of a modern interpretation. This is the whole show, a whole mini series, a whole life. But I want to
Mhm.
get that out there because I think it's very important for talking about what we're talking about right now. We want you to join the dialogue, to get in the conversation. But if someone's like, well, what you're talking about isn't in the ancient texts, right? I think we are using them as a foundation. I think we are thinking through them in an adaptive way that is actually true to that tradition instead of just taking random things and smushing them in there, if that makes sense.
Like just from like textual analysis or a chain of ideas kind of approach, I think one of the interesting things that we're dealing with on something like this is that a lot of other religious traditions, at least as we experience them, have worked things out in the open for hundreds and thousands of years. Whereas what we generally call Gnosticism had a particular heyday during a particular period. It also had some opposition not long after that that we can refer to texts from. And then there's not a lot of development from those communities and texts, other than some groups that are even still operating today, and some approaches that I think we could still define as Gnosticism, even though they don't have a chain of lineage or a chain of textual association. But mostly, I think the big bang of it is that we get the Nag Hammadi Codex in the 40s or 50s, and then bam, it's like a phone call to the year 200. And we're interacting with texts and ideas and language that hasn't changed for 1800 years, but we have. And so, like, one of the things, I'm completely speculating on this, but one of the things that I note on the subject is that when somebody looks at ancient Gnostic texts and they say, oh yeah, it says right here the world's a prison, I'm like, well, yeah, but when they wrote that, like, they weren't thinking Alcatraz. Do you know what I mean? They weren't thinking institutional, like, prisons the size of cities. I mean, they could have been also thinking of the kind of slave labor that built pyramids and temples and things like that. So it's not that they were unaware of an ability for humans to treat each other badly, but that when you hear the world's a prison in the modern day, you're thinking of something else, you know?
Yes.
And so I think just that notion of another reason we need to take the texts seriously, but not literally, is simply because we're not interacting with those texts the way those people would understand how we are interacting with those texts from that period. Whereas, like today, if you're reading a Bible, you probably are reading a Bible that the current heads of Catholicism and Anglicanism, etc., are at least very aware of and have a lot of opinions on and can discuss all of it.
Yeah.
You know, that just doesn't exist for Gnosticism. I often say on Gnostic Reddit, there is no Gnostic Pope. Do you know what I mean? Most of the time, people who love Gnosticism love to be rebels. So I would say you should not want there to be a Gnostic Pope, and you should not want to take any text at face value, because that's the point. Like, that's the point, is criticality and doubt and things like that. And to again bring this back to the Gnosis as a subject, because this drifts out in all these other places, is this question of something I've been saying about, is that doubt, criticism, or being critical, an acceptance of mystery at the foundation of a lot of this stuff, that is that an unresolvedness, like there's no, we'll never solve Gnosticism, we'll never get to the end. I think because it's connected to this notion that the experience people are having can be both salvific in the sense of offering change. At the very least, it makes you different, and it does seem to perhaps make people feel that they've changed in a way that seems positive, but that the experience is not wholly positive, and that sitting in that uncertainty, I think, is important. Gnosis isn't uncertainty, but we should be uncertain in our assumptions about Gnosis. There should always be a level, like there should always be an extra step that we always feel that it needs to happen. And that's part of the issue. It's like Zeno's paradox. I think if you're a kilometer away from something, you travel half that distance, and then half that distance, and then half that distance. Eventually, to any observer, it'll look like you're standing right on it, but you are still always approaching only by degrees.
Yeah.
You know?
And I think that's, particularly from my understanding of Gnosis and Gnosticism, incredibly deep and incredibly important, which is the journey doesn't end, right? So you don't have the Gnostic experience, become a Gnostic, and are enlightened, right? It's always this journey forward. And sometimes it's a journey forward, then backwards, right?
Mm-hmm.
2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I think some people, and again, this is getting into a modern philosophical Jon interpretation of Gnosticism, right? Maybe it's not wholly within the text, but we see God creating, we see that this process of the spilling out of God, of emanations, something goes wrong with the emanations, this world is created. And I think a lot of people then assume what happens next is, okay, the world goes away and human beings are beamed into one of the aeons, one of these emanations, right? In Secret Book of John, there's actually an emanation, an aeon, which is kind of set up for us. I think that perhaps because Gnosticism is the story of God coming to know itself, that of course God is unknowable. That's how Secret John opens up. But both the monads unknowable, but also the unknown Father, you can probably, which is the highest emanation that a lot of people think of as what God is, right? The unknown Father is also unknowable. You can probably guess that from his name. We're told that there's this unknowability at the highest levels of the Godhead. So maybe this cosmic adventure of emanation and knowing continues. Of course, we're also talking about an aspect of reality that doesn't have time, right? But maybe the whole thing doesn't just like get folded up and we go to Gnostic heaven and that's the end of the story. Maybe the emanations continue after Sophia's error is fixed, right? Maybe God does something new and exciting and interesting. And I think that pertains to our own lives, right? So we don't just hit this elevated point where we're there forever. We don't, or if there is something new to be known, it's trivia, even if it's something very deep, right? It's not going to change my enlightened state of being if I, know more about the periodic table. But I think that this is the wrong way of talking about it or thinking about it, maybe even a dangerous way of thinking about it, right? You just get there and then that's it. That it is an ongoing adventure, an ongoing journey, and that we sort of circle around the divine spark, circle around the divine. We have these encounters and experiences where we have more of a wholeness, a more of an expansiveness, more love, more gnosis, but we don't reach an endpoint. And then I don't think people want to hear this, but I think that it's exciting, good. I think it's an interesting way of thinking about things, which is maybe there's less suffering or no suffering, but the journey continues, maybe even after death, maybe whatever the divine spark goes on further adventures as God seeks to know itself. Tie that all into something I think is getting rid of this, as I said, perhaps dangerous idea of getting so much gnosis, you become perfect, right? That so much gnosis leads to a plateau state of perfection within this life. Now, some of the texts do indicate that, but there's something really funny in Secret John, Jason, which is somewhere's near the end. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing, but the book still has a lot of issues with the body and materiality, right? We talk about the kind of pushing back against that's the be all end all of Gnosticism, this sort of very strict body spirit duality. But all that said, it still has some issues with it that are worth discussing. So, it talks about all these things, all these problems with the body. And then at the end, it says, basically the huge paraphrase here, if you reach gnosis, you have the divine ascent, then you're perfected in all ways. And then there's a really funny line, except for everything relating to the body. And then, it's the thing is the text talks so much, and by the body doesn't just mean the physical body, right? The body is also what we would probably now call the animal mind, right? There's an aspect of non-materiality that is also part of the body. So it's the drives, and stoic language would be the passions, right? The passions have a lot to the body. The Secret Book of John can be very stoic, right? It talks a lot about giving into the passions is not a great thing. So, I imagine maybe this line is meant to be paradoxical. It's meant to catch you by surprise and for you to chew on, because you don't even notice it at first because it's just like a little asterisk. You're just moving on. It doesn't highlight this in a way that is very obvious so that you can theologize on it. It's just like a little note as you're moving on. But it's like, well, wait a minute. Like, isn't that huge? Isn't that part of the crux of this entire story, of this entire book? Oh yeah, you'll be absolutely perfected, you'll be enlightened, you will have this state that everybody wants, you'll be a Christ, you'll be a Buddha, asterisk, except for everything relating to the body, which we just talked about, is like all the things that you probably don't like. So yeah, I think there's a very, very powerful paradox there, and it is in the text. But yeah, it's just we need to do some shows on enlightenment, mini series on enlightenment. But I think this is very important for this show and this topic, right? That gnosis will utterly perfect me because and I've experienced this. You probably have. I think any spiritual person has, where at no point did I think that I was enlightened or had it all figured out or was perfect, right? I've sort of had this idea for a very long time about reaching perfection, right? That it's impossible as we understand it. Big asterisks there, as we understand it, as we want it to be. But there's times in my life where I'm like, okay, I haven't figured out, right? And then, I'm teaching meditation, I'm meditating all the time. I feel happy. I feel relaxed. I feel like I have worked through a lot of my shit. I am not pushing my shit out on other people. And then, something happens in my life and it just all goes to pieces.
Mhm.
So the thinking that you have it all figured out can be incredibly dangerous, right? And it can lead to psychopathic behavior, and it can lead to some very dark places in one's behavior and the way that they carry themselves in the world. So I think it's very relevant to what we're talking about because I think a
Yeah.
lot of people think that it is a math equation, right? So the gnosis plus time equals enlightened perfection.
I think there's like I think you're right. There is that danger of thinking that you've got it figured out or that you will have it figured out, and that until you have it figured out, nothing else is important than to pursue maximal gnosis to the nth degree. So I think there's a big part of it. I think too, like probably some of the most pernicious experiences that I've seen out there of the kind of Gnosticism that bother me are those who make bold sweeping statements about the things that you need to do to make sure you get gnosis, or at least to do the right things. And the only thing I can assume is that the people involved have not necessarily had gnosis, but have had some level of personal excitement while meditating, while experiencing these things, and either feel that they've got it or feel that they're close enough and that they can now teach it. What is it we think we're connecting to when we experience gnosis? But first, on that mind body thing, is that, like, again, I think something that we've talked a lot about here is that it's an experiential thing, it's not a logical thing. Imagination is connected, at least with what we've built up in this conversation so far, but that I think there's also something perhaps that in terms of what makes it gnosis and not just an imaginative experience is that perhaps it is something that does happen more than just with the mind in a mental experience. Like perhaps it is a full sensory experience, and that's maybe even why some of these stories involved like a sense through the spheres and stuff like that, and not just like an argument with Satan until he gives up and then you get to go to heaven kind of thing. Like it's something that you feel as well as know, and that's why it's not knowing in a logical sense.
I think you're onto something, particularly for these high peak experiences. So it may not be every Gnostic experience, but the self is fragmented, right? We have a body. If you're gonna go to Secret John, then there's the body, spirit, soul, and the counterfeit spirit, right? If you look towards Buddhism, psychoanalysis, right? When you have Freud, you have the ego, the id, and the superego, right? I guess, and the body as well. It's sort of contained within there. So we have this fragment itself. We know this. We know this within our mind. We have these different faculties. So maybe these highest peak experiences, these Gnostic experiences, is the entire self experiencing, as you were saying, right? Is
Mhm.
these fragments itself actually experiencing this all at the same time in a sort of unified way. Hence, you're engaging the imagination, you're engaging the body, or the faculties are engaged, as opposed to other experiences, other thinking, other fantastical imaginative experiences, which are just using one aspect of the mind, one aspect of the self.
Yeah. And I think like the dualism of the mind and body, I think that is one of those. I often call them Gnostic traps, in the sense of it's a trap that a lot of Gnostics can fall into, which is seeing the body as somehow separate from Gnosis and separate from a spiritual experience. That, like, because the body is the thing in which you feel pain,
Yeah.
therefore it is a bad thing. Do you know what I mean? If we're talking about something that is not just a purely mental experience, then it is probably situated somehow in the physicality that is our body.
No, I think we do have to start wrapping up. I suspect that we will have more shows on this topic, 100%, even though this is already kind of the third. But I think I wanted to wrap up with a point that does reiterate some of what I was talking about. But, we have talked a lot about peak experiences,
Mhm.
which is not everybody has had peak experiences. There seems to be, well, I take that back. Everybody has had at least some taste of it, this transcendence, right? Sometimes you get it from running. Sometimes you get it from being in nature. Sometimes you get it from
Mhm.
holding a baby, what have you, right? But I think a lot of the very high, perhaps long, the explicitly spiritual peak experiences are visions, talking to God, what have you, are rare, right? Are rarer in modernity. Some people seem to have them more than others. This seems to be a preset. I'm always reminded of the Buddhists. So the point of meditation is not to have mystical experiences, right?
Mhm.
And there's the saying that if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill the Buddha. That is, if you're meditating and you start having these wonderful experiences, the Buddha appears to you and starts giving you all the knowledge of the universe. You say, not right now, I'm meditating. That's not what I'm here for. I've even heard it said in Christian context with centering prayer, which is very similar to meditation, which is the Virgin Mary appears to you and you say, not right now, dear. So even with a spiritual practice, perhaps even with some of the weirder ritual ooky stuff where you're trying to summon angels and stuff, right? If you don't have an experience or a vision, maybe you're not doing it wrong, and maybe that's not the point. Maybe it can
Mm,
be a nice thing to have happen to you, right? And I say this because some people are going to do their best to have peak experiences and not have them, right? So this is why
mhm,
we have to look for these Gnostic experiences in our day to day, in the mundane, in some ways that are even more day to day, or in some ways negative. So, like for me, an example of what I'm talking about of a Gnostic experience would be visiting a friend in hospice and seeing how well the nurses are taking care of them, and then experientially understanding that this is the divine spark both in the nurse and in your dying friend. Right, that
mhm,
is a Gnostic experience. It leads to Gnosis and it leads to change. Right. If you actually had that experience, you're not actually standing there intellectually thinking about it, but in some ways you acknowledge, experience, and see the divine spark in motion, in action. That will hopefully change your actions in the future. And the problem with peak experiences is that, as we talked about, there's a lot of interpretation that has to happen with them. They're hard to have, can sometimes divert you from what you're doing, right? A lot of people have them again during meditation. And they sort of implant or give immediately after having them sort of a false gnosis. And I know this from firsthand experience, but also people I've talked to, and it's a very common thing, I'd say, in spiritual circles, is you do have this peak experience at a meditation retreat. And then again, you have it all figured out because of the experience, right? You're going to go back to your day-to-day life and you're going to be a kinder, gentler, more spiritual person. But then, you go back and you have to go back to work. And next thing you're grinding your teeth and swearing at your co-employee, and you're worried and you're frantic and you're not sleeping well and yada, yada, yada. Because you are out of that special atmosphere, special environment you are in, right? It's a lot easier to have a mystical experience, think that you have it all figured out, then not change when the next day you're just getting up and you're meditating again, right? I have to go out into the world. That this happened to be, I remember my parents randomly sent me to an evangelical summer camp. I think it was they weren't particularly religious. I don't think they knew it was evangelical. I didn't know it was evangelical. They were just looking for a place to park a kid for part of the summer so they could have an effing break, right? And I remember there having such a powerful experience with the whole, nobody was like speaking in tongues, but people were sort of twitching, right? And people were going up and giving their testament. And, tears were streaming down people's faces. And, I remember tears streaming down my face and just being like, yeah, I'm going to live my entire life for Christ. And then it also feeling that it was easy, right? Now that I've
mhm,
had this experience, now that I've seen it, now that I felt the power of the Lord moving in my spirit, like, committing any kind of quote unquote sin, I'm not going to do that anymore. I have the power now. This is so easy. But again, once I'm out of that environment as a little kid,
mhm,
it's back to ABC. So to wrap up what I'm saying, this emphasis on gnosis and the Gnostic experience always being a peak experience, having to be a peak experience, must be a peak experience, can only be a peak experience. I do want to trouble that a bit, right?
mm,
Now,
yeah,
I'm also not saying that you shouldn't or not try to have them, or it's bad if you do have them, and you should have them. They should be life changing. You know what I mean?
mhm,
I think I've explained myself well. I'm not
yeah,
being completely anti-peak experience, but I think
uh,
that
yeah.
that can be a bit of a trap.
Well, it also makes me think a bit about where some of these texts come from, where some of these practices come from. I might imagine a world full of entities that want to trap me, particularly when I'm trying to have a peak experience and my physical body and my life situation are all these things that are getting in the way of that.
Yeah.
Like, so even before I'm totally vibing at the retreat, while I'm sitting there on the cushion for the first day, and it's like all I can think about are the things that I haven't done, and the fact that I'm hungry, and and the fact that like my eye is twitching, and all of these things, and then go like, oh, this flesh is a prison.
Yeah.
That's an understandable next step to take when you're trying to disconnect, which is maybe also like it's also the lesson of like, well, maybe you're trying the wrong way. You know what I mean? Maybe you're focusing on the wrong thing if you're letting all of this stuff bother you in the process. The other thing is, and maybe this is my way of kind of rounding out here, I sort of teased at the end that we were going to talk about what it is we're actually connecting to. And I've also said before on the show and elsewhere, this issue or the problem of like, what's the value of Gnosticism when I'm stuck in traffic? How can I have a, if not peak experience, how can I at least have a moment of recognition of the divine spark in myself and my fellow man when somebody just cut me off in traffic, or when I'm being delayed, or somehow somebody's getting in my way in an environment which tends to be highly stressful? And I think like one of the things that does happen when I have tried this, when I've tried to, see the divine spark in the world around me in a place in which I'm in a car, for one thing, which is a very mechanized, modern, technological, informed by economics environment to be in, on a road, which is part of the same thing, surrounded by other people who are already trapped in these same things. Just trying to have that connection, for one thing, it opens me up to empathy, to empathizing with everybody else on the road with me. It gives me a much wider view of the situation that I'm in and seeing the experience of it and how I'm letting that experience affect me. So in that respect, it's often probably doing that so distancing that stoicism also often allows. Like, what am I letting in this experience get into my, it cause me an overwhelming passion rather than allowing me to be rational. And yeah, and so when I do all of those things, and I'm not saying I achieve gnosis on the highway all the time, but when I do all those things, I think I am often creating a space in which I can feel connected or part of something so much bigger and other than me that it makes me feel, puts any of my momentary frustrations and discomforts and even excitements in a different light, in a different spark, perhaps. That thing, that wider view is probably still me only vaguely brushing against the peak, as in highest, not as in best, experience slash layer of reality of which we are all a part, if that makes sense. That sense of connectedness that goes beyond anything else. And I think also, for me at least, this is purely Jason's Gnosticism now, is not another dimension. It's not another place that the monad lives in that we all then go to, and that this is a place that's further away from that or blocked away from that. At most, in an emanation kind of idea, it might be further away, but not unconnected.
Yeah.
And that what my Gnosticism experience might be is not me escaping the layer of reality that I'm in, but gaining perspective on how all of those layers are connected.
Absolutely. I think too that there's a very important teaching that I was talking about earlier, which is the importance of Gnostic ascent for the earlier Gnostics, right? Which happens in this life. It's not a post-mortem thing. So right there, we have a teaching that this is something that happens to you in this life, right? You go, quote unquote, to other place, which is actually here, and you come back with Gnosis, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is sort of the primary understanding of sort of the purpose of reflecting upon the aeons and the emanations, right? It's not just an explanation in the origin story of the universe, right? It's part of the map for living in this life, having spiritual experiences, getting gnosis. And it's still very centered on the self, the body right here, right now. Because yes,
Mm-hmm.
you're quote unquote going somewhere else, you're ascending. But the important part is the descent, the coming back. I think for what you're talking about, Jason, Gnosticism, instead of being dualistic, is radically immanent and incarnational, right? Because the
Mm.
divine, even if it is trapped, if you're going to use that mythology or that term, if it is trapped in matter, it's everywhere, right? All human beings have the divine spark. It's a higher level of incarnational theology than many forms of mainline Christianity, right? God
Mm-hmm.
has poured itself out into matter, into the universe. So is radically immanent. So it would also make sense that it would happen on this layer as you talk about, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's not about getting away from this layer, as you're discussing, but just to paraphrase what you were saying, it's about seeing the bigger picture. You ascend, you see how we're connected. You see those deeper layers. You see how reality is structured, right? But this experience is not leaving this reality behind necessarily. It's part of seeing the truth of this reality. I think we have been hitting almost an hour 20, and folks are just scratching the surface. I suspect we'll have probably a number of sequels to the show, even though this is already the third one in an unofficial series.
Definitely feel free to check us out at patreon.com/Gnostic. We would love to have your support. PayPal.me/Gnostic is another way you can support us. We're very flexible on the tiers that you can use, and we don't hold anything back either. We're not a brand that we're asking you to buy into. We're also not even, frankly, experts. There are people out there who you should take their courses. You should pay their Patreons to get the premium content, because David Litwa, I think, is doing a lot of work. David Litwa is doing a lot of work on that right now.
Yeah, if you have $5 a month and you're like, okay, I'm really broke, I can give it to either Talk Gnosis or M. David Litwa. Please give it to Dr. Litwa. But if you have
Yeah,
$10,
$10.
give him five and give us five.
But yeah, and honestly, the other part of that too is the more support we do have, then the easier it gets to make the show, which means you will get more episodes faster.
You will get more episodes faster, and perhaps we're just basically getting back to 4 a month now. Especially with the new Mapping Gnosticism show, we're hoping to do even more than that. And your financial support helps us do more shows. And I would really love to get to 2 a week. The final thing I'll say about the money stuff is the way we have the Patreon set up right now. It's an amount for a piece of media per month, right? We put out the 5 shows, and you have the tier at $1 per piece of medium. That means that you pay $5. Patreon's making some changes. They're getting rid of that system. They soon can only do subscriptions. So we'll set up the tier so you can do as little as $1 per month, right? So that means if you set your tier at $1, you only get charged $1 per month, no matter how much we put out, right? So you don't get charged $5, what have you. As part of that, so Patreon's making that change. We don't have any choice in it, but we can push a button and switch over faster. I'm not going to hit the charge button unless we put out 4 pieces of media per month. Does that make sense?
Right.
Oh, I just want people to know we have been a bit unsteady. We're getting back. But, if you do put down that amount, you're always going to get at least 4 pieces of content per month, right? And if something happens and we can't do 4, we can only do 3, then we won't charge you that month. So sign up for as little as $1 per month, and that would be a huge help, and you'll get even more content.
Speaking of more content, coming up soon, we're going to continue this series. This is Mapping Gnosticism is probably never going to finish, and we will even be coming back to this particular subject of what is Gnosis. In our next episode on this subject will involve a survey that I put out. It's unofficial survey. It's whoever's finding it online, probably mostly the people who are on the Gnostic Reddit. If you are interested and you're hearing this episode and we haven't already released the survey results episode, definitely check us out at thegnosticwisdom.net or the Reddit. I think it's a pinned post on the Gnostic Reddit right now, probably in the links for the show for this. Check out that survey, fill it out if you haven't already. The whole point of that survey and our conversation about it is to just start to have a discussion of how are people finding Gnosticism? Where are they starting from that leads to them to certain conclusions? I know what mine are. I have a sense of what John's are, but even among the people that are very close to us, there's times where they'll mention something. I'm like, oh, I have no idea that you came across the idea that way. And I think for us to talk about mapping Gnosticism, we need the fellow people on the journey to let us know what's in their travel bag. So, yeah.
Look, I said this before, and I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about how good, holy, and righteous Jason and I are. But, if the shoe fits. The thing is people say they want to hear from you because they want engagement, right? Engagement drives traffic. It gets you more hits. Just like I was saying with the comments, that's not why, right? Like the word community should be banned. It makes my skin crawl whenever I hear it nowadays because people talk about, I'm a fan of Marvel movies. We're a community, right? That's pseudo community. That's Gnostic community. That's demiurgic community, if you ask me. So that said, so I'm wary of the C word, but Jason and I are part of communities. We're part of authentic Gnostic communities. We want to be part of an online community as much as that's possible, right? So we want to have a Talk Gnosis and Gnostic Wisdom community. I mean, we already do. We've been doing the show for a long time. We hear from a lot. We have guests who have become friends, yada, yada, yada. We want to develop this even more, right? And the thing is that I'm not a smart man. This is why. My whole life I wear glasses and I can talk a lot, so I've been able to fool people. But the truth of the matter is I'm a big dummy. So that's why I need your Gnosis, right? Like we really, really want to hear from you because it will help us. It'll help other people. Getting your journey and your ideas out there is going to help somebody else reach Gnosis. So please, please, fill out that form if you haven't already. We'll put the link in, as Jason said. And then please comment. Please send us comments. Please get the conversation going. Please feel free to challenge us and to tell us where we're wrong, as long as you're not telling us that we're going to double hockey sticks because we're sinners or devil worshippers or whatever.
If you want to tell us that, we may talk about it on the show.
Yeah, that's true, actually. Yeah, tell us that too. Okay, we should say goodbye. Take care, everybody. Jason.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.